and welcome, and thank you so much for having agreed to be able to chat to us here, Mary. Just a brief introduction. My name is Chris M. Gordon. I am the CEO of the Irish Social Enterprise, a national network for social enterprise here in Ireland, joined ably by one of the leading academics who's involved work in research for the Commission and Irish national policy for a good number of years, Professor Dr. Mary O'Shaughnessy. Not 100% sure which best title to use for you, but Mary, delighted that you're able to join us to be able to talk about rural social enterprise here today.
My pleasure, Chris. Very happy to join you in this conversation.
Over the years, we've been chatting just sort of on and off, but to be able to speak about social enterprise and rural social enterprise specifically would be fantastic. But maybe if you could kick off, maybe telling us what your title is and the organization that you're involved in, UCC, and maybe an overview of your work. I know why you're an expert in social enterprise and rural social enterprise, and I hope most people do, but could you give us a sense of who you are, some of the work that led you to this?
I'd be happy to, Chris. So as you can see in the lovely backdrop to my Zoom screen, I work at Cork, University College Cork. I'm within the business school, which is Cork University Business School, which is one of the largest business schools in the country, and I am the head of the Department of Food Business and Development. My interest in this area, well, obviously my research has always been focused on rural, particularly rural businesses, and most notably in the area of survival strategies of small-scale rural businesses, which really brought me to the whole subject area of social enterprises, because of course, when you research rural and you understand issues around entrepreneurship, innovation, the dynamics of rural communities, it's hard not to notice the importance of, in particular, community-based structures which operate as social enterprises. So my journey has been in the wider social economy. I mean, when I started at University College Cork, it was looking at the wider social economy within a rural context, more specifically then from the late 1990s onwards, when there began to be much more public discourse about this new type of entity, which wasn't a cooperative, but wasn't necessarily a private business, had entrepreneurial dimensions, but also was involved in meeting that triple bottom line that we're also very conscious of now, which is both people, profit, and planet. I began to understand, or try to understand, a little bit more about social enterprises. So my reach then went across Europe. I'm one of the founding members of MS, which is a European network of university institutions and researchers that began to study the emergence of social enterprises. So my very first piece of research at an EU level was with this group, which was looking at the emergence of social enterprises across Europe. And we were economists, sociologists, geographers, people from the area of public sector management. And really, in many ways, our initial group was a reflection of the kind of diversity which is associated with better trying to understand social enterprises, because they are a very unique type of organizational form that perform many roles within society and have different layers in terms of needing to understand it. So that's where I started. I'm glad to say I'm still a member of MS. I'm still on the board of directors. We have grown in strength, and it also has meant that I've been able to create more of an agenda around rural social entrepreneurship within the business school and within my own university.
Do you know what, just to be reminded, it's fascinating that you're starting off talking about rural communities, but you've clearly identified that social economy players and actors, social enterprises, have been such an important role in the development of them. But clearly then moving through to the national policy and then onto your European experience. Look, firmly established.
I suppose, Chris, it's also very important to remember that about 83% of the entire EU rural territory is rural, and it holds about 31% of the EU population. So rural is very important. In Ireland, we are one of the most rural countries within the European Union, and it's estimated that about 50% of our national population still live in rural areas, including small villages and towns. So rural is very important, and I think that's why my interest is in understanding all the different elements that make a contribution to sustainable regional and rural development, that social enterprises have a place in that.
I suppose it's really interesting you've identified them, but clearly you've got a wider reach in rural policy and urban policy. Can I ask then maybe a general question, which may or may not have a succinct answer, but it's what is the difference between urban and rural social enterprise? Is there a difference?
That's actually some of our research agenda. So we've had a research agenda at Cork University Business School for probably over 6 years now at this stage, kickstarted by us being very successful in acquiring a Marie Curie ITN network, which was meant we were part of a network of Marie Curie scholars, essentially, that allowed us to have 10 PhD students who were specifically looking at the issue around better understanding rural social enterprises. So 6 years ago, we wouldn't have had such clarity around the distinction between urban and rural because there wasn't necessarily that analysis done. We were in Cork one of the very first group of academics to do a systematic literature review of understanding rural a little bit better. So if I was to say from a purely from a theoretical viewpoint, what we are discovering from the very in-depth empirical research that we're doing is that rural social enterprises have enormous capacity to operate within what we call the wider substantive economy. They have the ability to mobilize different sets of resources because of the social capital and actually the proximity that you get in a rural area that often you mightn't find in other regions. Now, of course, our next funded research would be to do some more empirical work on comparing urban and rural, but the high degree of volunteerism, the high degree of reciprocation, and also the kind of activities that we find rural-based social enterprises lend themselves to be more community-based rather than sector or service specific. So that's one initial distinction that we can see between maybe urban and rural based social enterprises. We also, yeah, sorry.
No, that can continue, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take a question. Yes.
I was thinking, you're saying that it's not necessarily sector specific, it's definitely rooted in the community. Is it therefore, I suppose, rural synonymous with the word local a little bit more, or is that?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's it's probably more synonymous with the word of kind of local organizations that have maybe a collective identity, and that collective identity is often rooted in space and place, so we're going into the geography and our analysis really takes a kind of a geographical, a spatial perspective, because when you started to say what's the difference between urban and rural, I thought, okay, spatially urban and rural are very different because of population density, because of the nature of those regions. So you have at the basic level, there's a difference in the kind of context in which rural and urban social enterprises operate. And really for us as researchers, it's about better understanding those contexts, which include space and place identity, regional governance, connectivity with extra local resources. These are huge elements that often explain success or failure within a rural-based social enterprises. And that's been part of our research in more recent years, is to try and better understand the substantive nature of the economy in which these social enterprises operate, and how context does really matter. And not just from a spatial, as in where you are located, your degree of peripherality, your accessibility to other markets, and the unique selling point that you have as a social enterprise, but also the nature of the community in which you operate in, the connectivity within that community, your coexistence with other not-for-profit organizations, your connectivity with regional governance structures, and to your point earlier on, the nature of the national social policy or European policy that can support that as well. So they're all different parts of a jigsaw, and really it's about getting those parts together correctly to make it work.
And it's tricky because clearly you want to help simplify, but the interconnectedness and the nature of that obviously leads to a certain level of complexity. And obviously it's not one size fits all. It's obviously down to all of those factors.
That's it. And that complexity, I suppose, to my earlier point, is why you had so many disciplinary perspectives when we started MS looking at this, because there's the complexity about managing people within those organizations. There's the complexity about mobilizing resources. There's the complexity about communicating and marketing what you do. There's the complexity about being able to communicate with more official agents. And then there's the complexity of actually delivering a good quality service that people will want to use and use again.
And back onto the element of sectors, I presume I always talk about the idea of social enterprise being a row rather than a column, in the sense that like a column would be finance and education and health and all that type of thing, but the row, social enterprise, is all of those things, or has a small slice of a market deficit or something that they're taking over.
Yes,
The
yeah. I
general
mean, well, I
nature.
suppose it's either market failure or public failure, or sometimes there's just a really good sense of local solidarity, that there's something that people want to do, or there's an opportunity that people see locally to be able to mobilize those resources. So there's from the economic side, supply and demand, but there's also from a sociological, political side as well, where we can see the emergence of in particular rural-based social enterprises, and those that have a community identity, because of course there are other types of social enterprises as well.
Well, I hate to say this because this is maybe a terrible question, but just in a brief form, I suppose, from as early as you want to go, the development of social enterprise, and I realize we're talking about cooperatives and a whole host of other things, I'm sure, Mehel, but up to now, what is the nature of social enterprises been in your under whatever lens or framework that you choose? What has been the nature of rural social enterprises up to this point?
Well, I think you see my initial introduction to the whole area of social enterprises actually dates back to 1999.
Not
When
possible, but we'll move on.
No, yeah, when there was a conference up in the Green Isles Hotel in Dublin, and I think it coincided with the launch of an EU white paper on ways of developing the social economy. So for me, I was really interested in hearing for the first time more policy discourse around what the potential of the social economy could be. And it included both urban and rural areas. And that was the first time for me that you could see there was beginning to be much more political interest in realizing the potential of the social economy could operate to solve three main problems, as I recall on that day. Was one, dealing with long-term unemployment, which is a residual problem we have. Secondly, looking at the contraction of the welfare state. So the welfare state or public sector is getting smaller, and also the reticence on behalf of citizens to keep paying taxes into services maybe that they didn't necessarily think were good value for money. So you had those kind of three issues coming together, which to me underpinned that debate about what the role of the social economy could be. And so I think that what has happened in the past in Ireland was that there was a strong association with aligning social enterprises with solving long-term unemployment. And what you had in a rural context was it would address the problem perhaps maybe of long-term or hard to employ individuals perhaps, while also serving the need of meeting community services. So that two objectives of the initial white paper on looking at developing the rural sector, it kind of set the scene in many ways. And I think it aligns with also in the past our national spend on active labour market programs. All of these come together. And I think that we had the emergence of a much more, maybe not so specifically stated, because I don't think anyone had the terminology at that time, but what has become known as more work integration social enterprises, that this was very clearly the kind of trajectory we were going down in terms of developing the social economy, and recognizing that co-ops were very different, because we have credit unions and we have multi-purpose agricultural cooperatives and to a lesser extent worker cooperatives, but they were seen as a separate to these types of social enterprises that did have the support of government in order to meet this duality of, creating employment, but also meeting community needs. And I think that's been the basis for a lot of the emergence of the original social enterprises in rural areas in particular.
Just two brief questions. I suppose first one is, was there a view at the time that the social enterprise was tackling unemployment more in rural areas than in urban areas, or was
I don't think anyone had a view on that. I don't think anyone had a view. I don't think anyone had a view, because I think it would have been too early to form an opinion, because I think it was a relatively new concept that people were talking about. I mean, for those of us within the field of social economy, so my first introduction to the social economy was the work of people in the Open University who were writing about the social economy, and they were talking about this aspect of the economy, which wasn't for profit, wasn't private, but was characterized by a range of organizations that had these values and organizational forms that were very similar to a cooperative, but were not an industrial and provident society. So they were a new type of. So I don't think anybody had a definitive view on what would work better, but I think perhaps maybe. And I think my own research previously that I've written and published about, based on my studies of rural-based social enterprises, that in many cases, these were a solution to providing community services, and work integration was maybe a secondary objective, through no fault of anybody's, but actually work integration wasn't seen as the primary objective, that it was providing community-based services and availing of statutory support that happened to arrive in the form of an active labour market programme, like a community services.
Kind of more happenstance and two birds with one stone rather than on purpose and deliberative.
Absolutely. And I think that has evolved over time as well. But I think, from I think my first article that I published on the Social Enterprise Journal was making that point very clearly based on the evidence, and speaking to the people who are running these rural-based social enterprises.
Can I just ask maybe about policy and the sort of nature, and I suppose that'll lead us up to more modern times here. Has policy played a huge role in terms of assisting or preventing rural social enterprise development?
I think it's contributing to supporting. Yeah, definitely. I think it's, when policy, as we've had two major developments. We've had our own national social enterprise policy. So that gives a little bit of authority to the sector. I would regard it. It gives it recognition. It begins a conversation about what are social enterprises, and I don't know if we're still having those conversations. But I think we're I take it from a theoretical. I would do. I'm an academic in a university, but I have a very clear understanding as to what my understanding of what a social enterprise is, and I know what it is and I know what it's not. But I think that for other organizations that are maybe haven't been called as social enterprises or didn't identify themselves as it, that's where some of the ambiguity can occur sometimes. And so therefore then, when people see a new agenda, a new political agenda about promoting social enterprises, that's good, because that instigates a good conversation about what is a social enterprise. And
so would there be a defining point in 2019 when the policy came in? Was there a pre and a post? Is that the way you think about it, or do you think about it at all? Was there a defining point when that came through?
No, I don't think there was a pre and a post, but I think that, from an academic point of view, I think the policy has been really good in terms of supporting some of the ambitious targets that it's set, about putting it on the agenda, about developing a national census of social enterprises, about supporting research in the field. It's been really good about supporting research, about organizing conferences and meetings where people can come together to have those conversations or disagreements or whatever they are, that people are beginning to. And I think from our point of view as well, when there is a policy in the area, when there's research in the area, it means we can communicate this to new students and to young people. The average 18 and 19-year-old in the university that I'm in contact with now knows what a social enterprise is. We have Enactus at a university level. Those students are calling their enterprises social enterprises. So we are beginning to have a much greater embedding of the notion of a social enterprises, and for me within a university and a business school, that people see it as a potential type of business, but with the preface of it being a social business, means something right is happening, because we have a policy that we can point to. We have more and more evidence from research on a global, international, and thankfully in a national level based on the work that we're doing. So we've lots more practical insights to share with people as to what is there, what it looks like on the ground, how it gets started, what are the challenges it faces, how can you overcome them. So I think for me as a teacher, that's really good, because now I'm able to communicate that message to our own students. And we're finding a lot more researchers are approaching us to do more research on this and to better understand it and to look at it from different perspectives, in terms of how you manage a social enterprise, or how you might market it, or how you might develop it further. So that's really good. And when you have a policy, when you have a social business initiative at an EU level, when you have the amount of publications that have been generated in more recent times, then you begin to have more and more material to share with people, and to have these, discussions with students. So from a teaching point of view, we are really rich in more and more teaching content as well, and that's very important.
And it really does feel like there's an explosion of new education in general, I suppose, at all levels. I mean, I know you're talking about academic third level institution, but even at the courses that are now developed at secondary school, and the YSI network, the Young Social Innovators, and a wider perception of what social enterprise is. And
some of the training programs that have been developed, support from Erasmus, and yeah, there is just a growing level of content and understanding available, which is great.
And it kind of maybe emphasizes the point that there are no silver bullets, that because of the complexity of this, we need many different approaches to be able to help develop this and grow. I did want to ask about challenges and opportunities. I don't know whether you want to throw them all in together. Social enterprises rurally, do they face anything different as in terms of like potential that they've got, or maybe challenges that they face that maybe urban wouldn't have? Or is there any challenges or opportunities that you see?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't say it relative to urban, because I haven't focused enough on urban to
just social enterprise in general.
But the social enterprises in the rural areas that we have looked at, I mean, I think there's huge potential within the green economy. I think there's huge potential in areas like the bioeconomy. I think it could contribute much more sustainably to things like sustainable livelihoods in rural areas, to the retention of population, aligned with actually the competencies that we have in rural areas. So I think there's a lot more scope for looking at that, particularly in Ireland. I think we can look to Europe, and we can see where the green economy in rural areas has grown within the wider social economy. There's a lot of research out there. I think there's huge potential for us to look more closely in an Irish context. I also think that there are the difficulties, the challenges that we face is because, particularly for those community-based ones that we were looking at, there is a high reliance on volunteerism at a directorial level. There's a graying population in rural areas, so I think that is going to be a challenge, no different than any other organizations in rural areas where you may just suffer from volunteer burnout. There's potential for maybe developing economies of scale that maybe some social enterprises could look at more closely. So yeah, I think that again, it's because rural is not homogeneous. It's a very heterogeneous area. There are unique selling points of every rural area that we look at, and I think that has to be reflected as well in the approaches. So being a geographer and a sociologist by training, of course I'm going to advocate a more spatial, contextualized approach to the development of rural-based social enterprises. But there are some, as I've mentioned, some more generic challenges that will face the sector, and I think there are also very generic future opportunities for the sector as well.
There is a final question I'm going to ask you, not yet, which is about like next steps and all the rest of it. But I suppose it might be an opportunity just to say, or to ask you, is there anything, we've just been chatting here for a little bit about rural social enterprise. Is there anything like on your mind about, rural social enterprise? Is there anything that we haven't maybe necessarily covered so far or said, or is there bits that really stand out? I'm thinking about now for the future, because we know where we are.
Yeah, I think of course, again, coming from our research perspective and maybe the areas that we've been developing, I mean, I do think there's great potential alignment between rural development policies and between social enterprise policies, between community-led local development strategies at an EU level. I think we have in our research empirically demonstrated that social enterprises are really good actors for a neo-endogenous process of development, and a neo-endogenous process of development can at least contribute to greater social inclusion. So there is the importance of understanding that some rural areas are doing well, and some rural areas continue to suffer from some degree of regional or rural shrinkage. And when that happens, it has an impact on overall national economic performance. So, the ultimate thing is to try and make sure that all areas are able to realize their potential and make their contribution. And to my mind, social enterprises, rural-based social enterprises, are one of those agents of what we call a neo-endogenous process of development, and have the potential to facilitate a greater degree of broader rural social inclusion and rejuvenation of rural areas. So I think there needs to be a very specific focus on how that actually can be implemented and delivered through the policy environment. Given what we know about communities and their capacity to be able to, get on board with these kind of initiatives as well.
It just goes to show as well, again, this all hands on all the pumps type thing, and a little bit here and there. The rural policy obviously is affecting social enterprise policy. Social enterprise policy is affected by rural policy,
of course,
economic policy, health policy.
Exactly. And other types of policies both directly and indirectly affect rural areas as well. And so, we need to be cognizant of that, because it goes back to probably when the very first white paper on rural development was published way back in, I think it was 1999. One of the elements of that was that it called for rural proofing, and that still importance of rural proofing is still a very valid point, really, is that you look at what the consequences of this will be. And of course, we do operate economies of scale, and we're not, justifying the same spend in all areas, but we look at maybe what would be in part the solution or offset, what happens when one type of policy has a negative impact on that particular area. So it requires some level of consideration about the indirect and direct impacts of different types of policies.
Absolutely, yeah, so important. I suppose the final question there is for anybody who might be listening in about the next steps, or find out more information, or a thought or a piece of advice, or anything that sort of springs to mind. The floor is yours, Mary.
Well, then I would invite them to we're having an MS. MS is having its international conference in Frankfurt in September, and I and my colleague at UCC, Dr. Lucas Olmedo, we have convened with some other colleagues in Germany a whole one-day symposium on looking at issues around rural social enterprises, their contribution to neo-endogenous rural development, and particularly in areas like the social economy. And so we have amassed a very nice lineup of guest speakers and researchers and practitioners, because of course, most of the work we do within our research is very much involves policymakers, it involves practitioners and ourselves as academics, because we really feel that's the most important way of learning and transferring knowledge. And true to that, we have the symposium, and that will be really a first-time discussion of a very clear symposium, which is looking at issues around rural social enterprises. So there's lots of interesting, innovative research going on in the field. We're linking very closely with our policymakers. We've been very, very happy with the support that our policymakers and government has been giving us in terms of supporting research. And we do know that they're listening to us, which is very important, because lots of people talk about doing research and doing reports and it ending up, we know that's not the case. So we're very happy with the kind of support that we've been getting, and the ear that we've been getting in terms of our research. You might be familiar, there is a higher education institute network across the island, where we are bringing researchers with an interest in rural and social enterprises, and that's been fantastic. And really, that has been instigated as a result of department officials recognizing that all of you guys need to be talking as well as talking to us, and that's I think that's putting us in a very good space. So I'm very optimistic about future research in the field, and we're always glad to hear of any new research opportunities or new collaborations, or people who want to do more research on this issue of rural-based social enterprises, because rural is not going away. It's a very important item on the agenda, and will continue to be a very important item for the future as well, particularly in the context of looking at more sustainability.
Mary, I could talk to you for, as we already possibly have, days and weeks about the potential, and particularly rural social enterprise. It is great to get your thoughts and your insight into all of the areas. So I just want to say thank you so much for being able to join us here today. I am going to cut it short, unfortunately.
That's fine.
To move on, but thank you so much, and looking forward. I presume if anybody wants to reach out, clearly all of your research is available on the UCC website.
Absolutely, yeah, and under my own ORCID profile, all of those are widely available. So I'm happy to share that.
We are delighted. Thank you so much for joining us today. And
not at all. Thank you very much, Chris. Pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.